I would like to welcome everybody here to the Center for Competition Policy's annual conference of 2022. This is the first time we've had a hybrid conference, and so I really hope that you will enjoy the experience, whether you're in the room or whether you are out there. And so I'd like to welcome everyone. There are actually more than 500 people registered for this event, which you might not guess if you're in the room here, but there are many others who are out there, and so what we're saying today will have an influence and will be reaching people both in the UK and really around the world. Also, I would note that we are going to be putting the sessions onto a video that's made permanently available for all of the prepared remarks. So if any speaker wants to do something different, that's absolutely fine, and we can address that. But I just wanted to let you and the others on the virtual connection know about that. This is really a special event for us. And for those of you who might not have come across the CCP before, the Center for Competition Policy is a leading international center for multidisciplinary research on competition, regulation, and consumer policy. We are dedicated to creating high-quality research which has a relevance on policy and potentially an impact on that policy. We bring together the work of economists, lawyers, political scientists, and others, and really in the past we have found that the results of our research have actually been brought into many different policy decisions, and we've actually in the UK had very recently a review of all universities' research outputs, and among what they do in this analysis is to examine how the research has carried through and had some type of relevance to the world and been cited and influenced government decisions. And it turns out that in this review, the member faculty of the CCP have done a fantastic job, and I'd like to really thank them for their participation in this REF activity, whether their research was put forwards for the REF or not. We had lots of great cases, and the CCP was highly evaluated by this national review process in the UK. And that appreciation of the CCP work is not simply in the United Kingdom itself, but it's really international. That's why I believe that more than half of the people with us today for this conference are from outside the UK, and much of our work that we do on a regular basis is outside the UK. Whether it is in Brussels, sometimes we have projects there, and we have a number that are active right now, or whether it's in countries in Africa or Asia or Latin America. We have just signed a cooperation agreement, for example, with the University of Johannesburg in South Africa, where there's a very good center for competition law and economics, and where we're going to be pursuing joint activities in the future. This is really a special moment in economic regulation, and I just wanted to delve into that for a second, because so much is going on right now. It's not only in the digital area, but if we think about energy, there's a tsunami coming in energy that's really going to hit the headlines in this winter in a way that I think is unimaginable right now, but will be quite significant. And at the same time, there is a remaking of the regulatory state. The whole philosophy of approach to regulation is changing, both in the UK and in Brussels. And there are some good parts to that, and maybe some other parts that are worth questioning. So the great thing for us as academics is that this is going to bring in a real nice fruit of possibilities for new research and increased relevance also as we're examining changes that have occurred. We've been working not only with ministries and regulators in the UK, but also internationally. And some of our members have been quite influential in some of the recent changes in Europe that are, I guess, still officially to be finally approved, but the DMA and the regulations that are going to follow up from that. We have introduced in the last year a teaching program that's a professional teaching program that delivers a postgraduate certificate in competition policy and regulatory policy. And that PG Cert, as we call it, the postgraduate certificate, has been really successful in the first year, and we're just delighted that we're finding other ways to reach out and kind of convey some of the expertise that we have on the faculty. And we've also had fantastic master's and PhD programs. We have a number of our current and former PhD students with us here in the room today, and we're always open to new ones. So if you know of someone who might be interested in a master's or PhD degree that's relevant to the topics we're talking about today, please do point them in our direction as one possible place to study. We have very active research and cooperation in activities that are new. So we're helping to start a digital economy network for researchers in the UK, and that's going to have its first formal meeting later this year in our campus. And then we'll probably be rotating around to other campuses for future meetings of that group, and I'm very hopeful for what's going to happen there. We have had presentations and roles over the last year at UNCTAD, the OECD, regulators and ministries around the world, Chatham House, many other forums, and really our spirit is not to live in academic retreat. Instead, we are actively reaching out to convey what we have been doing in terms of research and to engage and better understand what the actual policy questions are as they evolve. Just a few announcements about personnel that I wanted to make so that those of you who've been following CCP are aware. Bruce Lyons, who has been a core member of the CCP, is actually going to be retiring later this year. So he will maintain his interest and activity with the group, for those of you who know him, but he will be less active day to day. And we just I want to reach out and give my special note to Steve Davis and my hope that he's doing well, and my hope that he'll be with us again for the next meeting, although he could not make it to this one. We have some new. Well, we also have another person in CCP who will be leaving, Frances Bowen, who's the dean responsible for the social sciences faculty at UEA, and I'd like to thank her for all the support that she has provided to the CCP. We have a new joiner to the CCP who will be coming along in September, I think, and that's Jens Pruford, who is here in the audience today and will be giving a talk as we run through the next 2 days. I'd like to thank the sponsors for this event, who include Clifford Chance, a gold sponsor, and they've provided us with this fantastic facility for the 2 days, and really huge thanks to them. Also, Compass Lexicon, ECA Economics, Flint, and NERA Economic Consulting are sponsors for this event, and I really appreciate what they've done and the commentary that they're also going to be bringing to this. I'd like to thank the CCP faculty and the students and the core CCP team that includes Peter Courage, who's here, and Bryn Enstone, who are here, and David Deller, who's not here today. The topics of this conference are illustrative of those in which our researchers currently work. That's the idea of today's event. And what I hope you'll take from this is that the work is really wide-ranging, it's timely, it's on the frontier, and it's very high quality. From food to artificial intelligence, from new topics like privacy to traditional ones like business compliance or merger policy, we are continuing to provide outputs that are pushing the boundaries of thought and practice. And today and tomorrow, we're really fortunate to be joined by not only the CCP faculty members who we have, but a number of fantastic and illustrious speakers and panelists, discussants and chairs who I really want to thank today. These 2 days are promising to contain a rich tapestry of discussion and analysis, and I hope that you will agree with me after it's all done that we have succeeded in putting together a very useful and interesting event that you will remember, from which you will remember some of the results for years to come. So thank you very much, and I'd like to invite the first panel to come up and to take their positions. All right.
I don't think it really matters. I'll go in the middle and then everybody. Yes. I'll sit. Positioning doesn't wholly matter because we're going to try and keep this relatively conversational. So thanks everybody, thanks Sean for the introduction. This first panel, Sean used the word illustrious, and I don't think it actually gets much more illustrious than this panel. We are going to be talking, the title is Regulation and Inflation, Where to Next? I had to reassure the panel that I wasn't going to ask them to present a thesis on the interaction between regulation and inflation, much as I'm sure they would have loved to develop that thesis. We're actually going to talk about them separately. So we're going to be talking about regulation, in particular digital regulation, flavour of the policy debate and where we are, looks like we are heading. And then we're going to talk about inflation and what the implications of a cost of living crisis might be in the spheres of competition, consumer policy and regulation. As I said, this is just the most amazing panel. It is a regulators panel. So we've got DG Comp, CMA, Ofcom, the Digital Regulation Cooperation Forum. And I'll just talk you through the panel members. So Olivier Guesson is the Director General of DG Competition. I think this year you're going to be celebrating 30 years at the Commission.
Personally, yes, indeed. I just celebrated on the 1st of June.
Okay, wow. Much of that has been in competition and also financial services, but lots of different areas. Jonathan Scott is the wonderful chair of the Competition and Markets Authority, where I'm also on the board, so I work with him closely. He was previously a NED at the Competition and Markets Authority, but also chair and senior partner at Herbert Smith. Also a huge amount of experience in the area of competition and regulation. We will be losing him from the CMA soon. He was only ever interim, but he was interim for quite a long time, and we were very pleased to keep him as long as we could. Louisa Afuso is Chief Economist at Ofcom, was previously at PwC, so again has absolutely tons of experience, and Ofcom is doing lots of really, really interesting things in the space, which we will hear about. And last but absolutely not least, Jill is in a way the new kid on the block in terms of competition and regulation, but she brings vast experience from other areas, including, as she will probably mention, she has spent time at Google, so she's kind of got a perspective from lots of different arenas, including in-house in tech. And she's now Chief Economist at the Digital Regulation Cooperation Forum, which is a body she will probably explain more about, but which brings together in the digital sphere the CMA, the Financial Conduct Authority, the Information Commissioner's Office and Ofcom to try and help us all coordinate more effectively. So as I said, the panel is going to be conversational. I do have a series of questions, but please do feel free to chip in at any point, really. So, Olivier, I'll start with you. The Commission, I mean, people will be aware there was a report that I was involved in here called the Furman Report, which recommended that there should be pro-competition digital markets regulation for a small number of the very largest platforms. We will hear about where the UK is on this, but actually the Commission has been incredibly fast in bringing this concept to fruition. Not quite through the legislative process yet, but very close. Could you, Olivier, maybe tell us a little bit about what the Commission is seeking to achieve with this regulation and how it's all going to work?
Well, certainly. Hello, everybody. Thank you, Sean and Amalia, for your invitation. Well, I think it's fair to say the Commission has been at the forefront of competition enforcement in the field of digital for the last, say, 25 years. You were kind enough to remind that I'm old enough to celebrate my 30 years. So I was involved in the first Microsoft case, for example, which was starting in the late 90s, completed in the early 2000s. And what we saw, in essence, is that large platforms, and Microsoft was probably the first one with Windows, answering what we call a gatekeeper function. In other words, able to control a market or dominant market that control access to a number of other adjacent markets, not to say vertical, whatever, adjacent, let's say. Well, they basically always engage into the same behaviors, which are not terribly, I mean, technological or fancy. I mean, it's good old stuff, leveraging, bundling. I mean, this is really textbook infringement for a dominant operator. But because of the characteristics of these markets, because these are tipping markets, because once they have tipped, they do not tip back, because the network effects are very strong and very quick to deploy. What we saw time after time is that we were too late with traditional enforcement. It's not that we're terribly slow, but if I just take the browser case for Microsoft, because it's in a way it's simpler. It complexified over time with the next cases, but it's always the same at the core. Well, it took us 4 years to get a case that, in the end of the day, withstood scrutiny by the court, so a good case. And that's not terribly long, because of course we had to face everything money can buy in terms of lawyers, economists, etc. And they used all the tricks that procedure can allow to slow down the investigation. And the question is why? Well, because although Internet Explorer was a worse product than the dominant one at the time, that was Netscape, it took only 6 months after it was embedded into Windows for Netscape to disappear. And of course never reappear again. So when we took the decision 4 years after, yes, we imposed an FT fine, but yes, the damage was done and it couldn't be undone anymore. And year after year, we saw the same patterns, because at the core it's always the same type of behavior by Google, by Amazon, by Facebook. And although the fines went up and up and up to incredible amounts, if you I mean, you go back 20 years, you see the amounts we reached, you would say, oh, that's insane. And yet they continue, and they happily pay, I would even say. And that suggests that this is profitable. So it's more profitable long-term to monopolize these markets, and it's therefore acceptable to pay a very heavy fine. So that also suggests this is not the solution. And so to answer your question through this long, that's exactly why we came with the DMA. Because we thought, well, look, I mean, we know that for this category of market players, large platforms with a very dominant position on a key market that control access to others, when they deploy this type of practices, we never found any efficiency that would justify this behavior. We always found it was bad for innovation and consumers, and we were always confirmed by the courts. Conclusion, from now on, it will simply not be possible. There's an outright prohibition. And then there are a number of smaller things around, but the core of the DMA is just above.
Thanks very much. I think that put it very much alive. Jonathan, so I mentioned the UK. The UK is developing its own pro-competition digital regulation. We've got, we are now a sovereign country, so we get our own regulation. How is the UK regulation expected to differ from the EU?
I think, Amelia, probably I just want to sort of almost start by going back a step, and a bit as Olivier was, and there's a lot of focus on difference, but actually I think that what is really important is the degree of commonality of what's underpinning this, the thought. And because I'm a sort of bear with a very little brain, I just went back to what it is that we are trying to achieve. We're trying to open digital markets to competition. We're trying to allow new players to challenge the incumbents, and we're trying to drive innovation. I think if you look at what underpins the DMA, what underpins the DMU, what underpins the work we've been doing with Ofcom, with digital, all of that is driven actually by a commonality. And I think it is really important that we keep on remembering that. So I think that is far, far more important. Yes, there is a difference in approach, and that is driven to some degree, I think, by the history of regulation in this country more generally. So it's a process that will involve investigation. It's going to involve looking firm by firm and activity by activity. And that leads, obviously, to decisions about strategic market status, and that then takes you through to codes of conduct and to pro-competitive interventions. But I think that, if you like, the difference may be a difference in emphasis or difference in focus, but I don't think that what underpins it will necessarily be very different indeed. I think it'll make comparisons quite hard. I think they're quite hard at the moment, and they will be harder as we move forward. But I think it's important, again, to remember this isn't a competition between regulators. And I was just, this is not directly on point, but I was just thinking about that in a sort of wider context this morning. And I spent, as a practitioner, when we were doing big deals across the pond, a whole amount of time, and Olivia, I guess, as a regulator, wondering whether it would be the FTC or the DOJ and turf wars. And I do think that the world of competition and regulation has moved on very, very significantly. And if I sort of stand back, one of the things that I'm probably most proud of, and I don't take the credit for, I would give it to Andrea Coscelli and to leadership at Ofcom and leadership at FCA, but that Jill is here today. I think the Digital Regulation Cooperation Forum is an extraordinary step in the right direction. And I hope that it will mean that, if we sort of stand back and think about perhaps some of the challenges to Big Pharma, which, Olivia, you were saying Microsoft took 4 years, and Big Pharma was still fighting some of those cases. The scope, I hope, and this is me now, the poacher turned gamekeeper, to say, that the scope of divide and rule, I hope, will be much less. But I also hope that in a very positive sense, that will feed through to the quality of the regulation. And just going back to sort of, will the outcomes ultimately be different? I'm not sure they are going to be. I think we are already seeing in some of our work sort of feed through from the DMA being slightly ahead, but that's actually playing through now to the reactions we're getting to some of the cases that we're proceeding with. So I'm very positive, and I'm not lying awake at night worrying about the differences.
I think that's very inspiring, and I fully agree. I think there are some interesting divergences on paper, but we're all very much, I hope we will remain singing from the same hymn sheet. So Louisa, you know, a lot of the people in this room will be kind of bread and butter focused on competition, but they aren't the only issues that arise in digital platform markets. I mean, obviously Ofcom has a competition role as well, but there's lots of different issues. It's a complex picture. There's also concern about online harms. There's concern about the impact of online platforms on publishers, on broadcasting, on media plurality. And all of these things are in Ofcom's bailiwick. Can you tell us a little bit more about these various issues?
Sure, and Ofcom, as the communications and media regulator, has traditionally been used to technological change, changing the markets we regulate, and obviously being very aware of the impact of network externalities, and having both levers of ex-ante regulation and competition powers. But really with these digital regulations, our markets have changed beyond recognition. If you just think about the way we use our communication services, we no longer call as we used to. We use WhatsApp, primarily kids communicate via online games. Broadcasting world is a completely different world. We have big platforms and users no longer watch in the same numbers linear television. It's primarily video on demand, and you know, the BBC is now competing with YouTube. So it's really a completely different set of markets that we are looking at, and where we really need to understand what are the issues, what are the questions, and whether they are questions of competition, making sure that that's preserved, that the markets stay open, that there is opportunity for entry, and what the right way of promoting that, and at the same time protecting users from a range of other potential issues. So certainly online harms is one that has been at the forefront of government thinking. We've got now the online safety bill, which is at its second reading in Parliament, and the idea there is really to try and set out a code for companies to design their systems to have trust and transparency at their core, and being fair and having a duty of care for users. The problem is the financial incentives are no longer aligned in that direction, and we know that content that generates more engagement tends to be quite often the more harmful content. So for us, it's a matter of now trying to think about what are the rules that we need to design to ensure that the incentives are aligned for platforms to take that care of users to prevent from the worst harms, and at the same time that regulation is sufficiently nimble so that we don't create regulatory burdens that then prevent entry and innovation. So there will be consultation in the new year on a new code of practice, but at the same time we are mindful of all the touch points with privacy, with protecting children, and competition primarily. And a lot of the harms that we're seeing are also unprecedented. The power in certain areas of, say, for example, spreading disinformation touches on a number of our duties in media plurality and ensuring that there is due accuracy in the news we see and we consume. And we know that now people consume news mainly online, and that means those news are fed by algorithms, and algorithms that we don't fully understand, and indeed the platforms themselves don't understand. We know there is some research from Twitter who discovered that their algorithms were pushing right-wing content above all other content, and they were not aware of the reason why. And so it's a whole new world where I think that we need a lot of research. We need to understand the impact of choice architecture on users and really design these rules to ensure that we maintain that plurality, we avoid the risk of polarization and ecosystems, which are really prominent with the platforms now becoming really the gatekeeper in a lot more markets than traditionally we're used to.
Yeah, none of which is easy.
Yeah.
So if I turn to Jill now, I mean, Jonathan's already said how impressed he is by the work of the Digital Regulation Cooperation Forum. I mean, what's obviously really interesting and what's come out from what Louisa just said is the way in which all these different policy areas rub up against each other. So competition, online harms we've heard about, and media plurality. There's also financial consumer protection. There's also, and you just mentioned privacy, which is overseen by the Information Commissioner's Office. And clearly there are synergies between these areas of work, but there are potential tensions between these areas of work, and all of those regulators can be more effective if they work together. So there is now the Digital Regulation Cooperation Forum, and with Jill, you at its head, could you tell us a little bit more about what you've been up to?
Of course.
Work?
Thank you, Amelia. And I appreciate the DRCF, as we call it, is a hell of a mouthful. And we all trip over it. So any other branding ideas are very welcome. The hashtag I think of is Tech Regulators Together, because I think that's sort of what we're really about. But for those of you who don't know us, if I just sort of set out, I think starting from the top is always a good one, which is what problem are we trying to solve? And that's sort of ingrained in me, having worked for a tech firm, because that's kind of your starting point. And I think really the starting point for the 4 member regulators who formed this forum a year and a half ago, sort of 2 years ago now, which is Ofcom, the ICO, the FCA and the CMA, was around recognising that digital services, digital companies are often global in nature. Digital services permeate through all industries, all firms, all consumer experiences now. And as Amelia and Louisa mentioned, and the sort of the intersections between boundaries are very much sort of blurred and overlapping in some areas. And so the simple premise was better together. Can we work through these issues together? Can we be more efficient and more effective by working through some of these areas jointly? Now, I'd say we consider ourselves very much to be a startup, not a tech startup, but a tech regulation startup, if you like. So we've just concluded on the first year of our work plan, and we've just commenced on the second year of our work plan. And in being the connective tissue between those 4 member regulatory organisations, what we seek to do in a sort of shared work plan is focus really on 3 areas. The first area is coherence. And I think coherence is where the regulatory regimes, both in existence today and those soon coming down the track, such as the Online Safety Bill, making sure we're sort of ahead of time where we can, resolving those sort of where there might be inherent tensions or natural touch points between those regulatory regimes, so that we can be clear ourselves in terms of roles, but also offer businesses clarity and consumers clarity as well in terms of where to go to. So that's sort of the area of coherence. We then work on collaboration, a broader bucket, but this is around big topical issues of the day that we are all have an interest in. And some of the work we just published on algorithmic processing, algorithmic audit, is a really good example of work where all 4 member regulators and others have a deep interest, quite a lot of growing expertise, and are sort of asking ourselves really good questions about sort of what's our role here and how can we shape and help these markets as they mature. The third area is on capability, and this is around the member regulators equipping ourselves to be sort of fit and successful both now and in the future. So this is about skills, training, capabilities, in terms of both training needs and hiring and retaining really qualified, excellent people who cover a range of responsibilities in digital regulation, more of as a profession, if you like, but also in really important areas such as horizon scanning. So looking across, looking sort of slightly to the horizon to see what are the emerging technologies and trends, both near, mid and long term, that we should be thinking about. So that's our sort of third area of capability. And if I sort of, we work in a kind of hub and spoke model. Very often people are interested in how on earth do you do that across 4 regulators. It was certainly the question I asked when I was going to interview. And so it's a really simple hub and spoke model. So there's a core team with chief exec, that's myself at the helm, and we sort of look at how we can support the organisation in delivering on our shared agenda. But then the real work, the expertise, if you like, sits in the spokes, which is the projects that we assemble with the respective experts of the organisations to really work on that. And a really good example of the type of work that we do was actually the joint work from the CMA and the ICO last year on the Google Privacy Sandbox initiative, if you like. And the work was to jointly work through both the competition and privacy implications of Google's proposed sort of removal of third-party cookies and, in effect, adverts that follow you around the web. And its proposals to do that had both competition implications but also important data protection implications. And so the work that was done via the DRCF was initially to do a joint policy statement around that, and then to apply that in the commitments and the revised commitments that Google put forward that have now been agreed, and that now moves into implementation and following through to make sure that those proposals are being implemented. So that's a kind of good example of sort of bilateral work that we have done. You mentioned research earlier in your opening one. The other thing we have done is launched a research portal I think we've got over 80 pieces of recent digital research from 8 regulators in the UK, not just ourselves but others, and that's fully available and accessible for all. So we hope by working more closely with academia and others, we can continue to kind of build and make available and easily discoverable the research that we have to offer. So there are some of the areas in terms of just our emphasis for this year, this coming year, and we've just published our work plan. I think protecting children online is sort of one of our really key areas of focus, and this is around work between Ofcom and the ICO. So with the online safety bill, their existing video sharing platform regime, and the age-appropriate design code, the children's code that sits in the Information Commissioner's Office regime, we need to bring that sort of together so that businesses have clarity in terms of what they need to work to, but also parents and groups working with children know where to go to if things aren't as they expect when their children are online. And so I think that's a good example of sort of joint work that is really addressing some of the biggest concerns that people have. I certainly do as a parent in terms of their online experiences today. So we've got a range of work. We're not the only ones sort of who have come together in this way. So it's never good to be that alone, is it? So I think we're a model of domestic cooperation, but it is one that has already been followed by the Netherlands, by Australia, and I think soon Ireland. And so far, the message from industry that we've heard has been hugely positive. So we've sort of had Microsoft's Vice Chair has called us one of the important early innovations of the 2020s. Very nice, we've got to follow through on that now. And equally, I think, when I started, I sort of went and met tech firms, large and small, and I was really heartened to hear their response, which is that they see this as a way of sort of getting clarity, sort of being able to move through these processes at greater pace. And so the response from industry has been really strong. Now, I think I will finish by just saying, we are a startup. we are very much trying to make sure that we're listening to all voices and prioritising in the right way. We're therefore open to feedback, and hence engaging these events is really important to us. So we're kind of taking a very iterative approach. So if we discover new priorities that really feel like they should be on our radar and on our roadmap, then we will kind of cycle through that accordingly. So please do give us your feedback. Thank you.
Great, thanks Jill. Okay, so I will turn to Olivier again. And we've heard about the UK online safety regulation. Obviously the EU has its own version of that, the Digital Services Act. I know that isn't absolutely in the bailiwick of DG Comp, but I know that you know a lot about what's going on there. Could you say maybe a little bit about the way forward in terms of actually bringing into reality both the Digital Markets Act and the Digital Services Act? Kind of what are the respective timetables, how are they going to be enforced? And actually, interestingly, will the EU have its own version of the DRCF?
Okay. Maybe you engaged us to be interactive. So maybe a word about the previous three questions and answers, because that's a lot of context for that question. I fully agree with Jonathan. I mean, the risk of fragmentation is what we hear each time the industry doesn't want us to do something. Oh God, but you're doing data. Why don't you gather together and decide together, knowing that it will take at best years? I don't believe there is a real risk of fragmentation, because Jonathan is very right. There is a shared diagnosis, at least in the major jurisdictions. The EU, the UK, the US, definitely we share the same analysis. We talk all the time. We exchange on our antitrust cases. And basically what we try to achieve through DMA, what you try to achieve, what the US, I hope they will have one of the bills at least passed, are trying to achieve is exactly the same thing. And so it is relatively unlikely, because we will work on the basis of the same concepts, that you have actually fragmentation. And certainly we didn't think it was a reason to slow down the DMA deployment, because we will still be there waiting. And nobody asked us for that, actually, among the colleagues in other jurisdictions either, to be completely clear. The second consideration relates to what Louisa said, and Jill as well. I mean, what we're talking about is really right in the middle of a number of policy regulatory fields. The DMA, of course, is center of gravity is, yes, on the side of competition, because it is about keeping market open, unchallengeable, or trying to restore it, much more complicated whenever they're not anymore. But it has a lot of interactions with regulatory matters, and take simply what is interoperability, for example. It has a lot to do with privacy, with data regulation. So you cannot really afford to implement it as a competition enforcer in isolation. And from then on, you have a multitude of possible models on how to do it together. What we chose in the EU, that will answer the last part of your question, because we've been successful 20 years ago with what the framework for telecoms in these days, Article 7 in particular, in which what was not yet DG Connect and what was already DG Comp cooperated in a task force in order to enforce that. It was about bringing competition onto cable networks and all sorts of networks at domestic level. We did that together. That worked very well. So we decided, well, why not do it together again? Because it worked well. We know we can work together. So this is what we're doing. They bring the technical expertise. We bring the competition expertise. We assemble joint teams, and we do it together. But yet you still have privacy, data regulation, etc. We cannot do it together with such a multitude of things. And this is where we have decided, well, actually the co-legislators have decided to create what we call the high-level group. And the high-level group is basically the community of all the regulators that have a stake in that game. And we will gather them as often as necessary. They're not operational, but we want to tell them what is it we are doing, what are the problems we are confronted with, discuss it with them, take their informal and formal advices, and use this, if necessary, to make the DMA equal going forward. So that's not quite what Jill is doing. That's not so different either. It's just a different way to reach the same end. And I'm sure there's many other ways to do that. So starting from this, what is it our own way of doing it is, of course, the DMA was indispensable, because it was indispensable to stop this move of ever increasing concentration around a handful of big platforms. But sometimes it's not enough, because there are things that, of course, you don't want big platforms to do, but you don't want actually anybody to do on the internet. And that's the DSA, essentially. It's a much more traditional regulatory approach. And therefore, by nature, the DSA is symmetric, the DMA is asymmetric. But yet, again, there are a number of overlaps, which is a further reason to do it together, actually. Also for reasons of resources that Jill mentioned, there is a relatively small market for data scientists. They are quite expensive, and our resources are limited. So, of course, it is interesting, rather than having a pocket of data scientists doing EMA things, another pocket actually doing traditional antitrust things, another pocket doing the DSA, maybe another one the Data Act, and yet another one cybersecurity. What we thought with my colleague Roberto Viola is maybe it's best to pull all of these guys and pull all our resources in one single unit on which we will draw. Of course, we will have to decide what is the work allocation of that unit, but that's probably more effective than trying to have small pockets of this scarce resource everywhere. So that's the way we see implementation, at least for that part of the use of the resources. And the same goes with the member states, of course. Because within the ECN, we'll need to decide what belongs to the DMA, what belongs to national regulations like 19A Germany, what belongs to 102 of the treaty or the equivalent national law. And colleagues in national commission authorities will do investigations same way the CMA will. And there as well, it might be interesting, particularly for the smallest jurisdictions in the EU, to pool resources and help them. So that would be smart in that respect as well. Which leads me to how we will move forward from now on. Well, the DMA is slightly ahead of the DSA in terms of planning, because DMA is about to be formally voted, so we expect it will be published in the official journal late September, maybe early October. As you know, it will enter into force 20 days after, because it's a regulation. Then we will have a first period of 6 months, because although we've been trying to have as much what we call self-executable provisions as possible, so that the platforms know what it is they can do and they cannot do, for a number of them we need to have implementing rules. So secondary legislations, this legislation needs to be drafted. Of course, we're not waiting for beginning of October to start. We have started already. But that will take quite some time. Once this is in force, I mean legally, in reality already now, we're talking with platforms about designation. Because of course they could say, and we could say, oh well, we don't know whether you will be you Facebook, you don't know whether you will be designated. Well, we know they know. It is extremely likely they will, or Google for search engine, for example. So therefore, they reached out already. we are engaged because there's no reason to have this discussion under huge time pressure in 6 months' time, where we could start it already now, but that creates for us a slight issue of resources because, of course, all of this will be staffed only once it is enforced. So, well, that's the joys of being a manager in the public sector. Anyway, we'll do it. So that's the way it will work. After that, the platforms which will have been designated for court platform services as gatekeepers will have further 6 months to basically comply. So that's why they anticipate, because I suspect they think 6 months is a bit short, so they would like to know as soon as possible what is it exactly they will have to comply with, and that's why we talk already. So all that means the DMA will be hitting the ground late 23, early 24 in terms of actual do's and don'ts for the platforms, and that will be sanctioned. For the DSA, it's a bit different because it will start later, but they don't have this 6 months and 6 months and 6 months. So it will also hit the ground most probably as the 1st of January 2024 on the ground. So relatively similar, and we'll of course try to align the two to the extent possible.
Great, thank you very much. Lots of very useful information there. So Jonathan, if I turn to you, obviously. The Queen's speech, I don't know if big people understand how the UK system works. We all kind of wait on tenterhooks to see what the Queen, in this case the Queen's crown, will say is going to be in the government's legislative agenda for the coming term. And sadly, the digital regulation wasn't in there, although draft digital regulation was in there. But nonetheless, the government has already funded the CMA to set up a shadow digital markets unit. How, in that kind of context, how do you see the work of the CMA and the digital markets unit developing over the next couple of years ahead of the legislation entering into statute?
Thanks, Amelia. And again, I think the first thing we should actually just take is the very strong positive commitment to the regulation. I wouldn't be human as chair if I hadn't been slightly disappointed, but I think we also need to be absolutely clear that we've been through COVID, we've been through the EU exit, which has impacted the country. We've got the war in Ukraine, we've got cost of living crisis. It is not for me to call what the political priorities are. But what, as you say, Amelia, is one, we've got a very strong endorsement for the direction of travel, and secondly, we've been given some money to get on and do it. And I think those are two very, very clear messages. I'm not going to go through our sort of portfolio of active cases, but I did sort of just look down the list that I was given last night, and I counted, I mean, you can either count 10 or you can count significantly more if you look at it sort of party by party, and I just looked a little bit across the playing field just to the extent of our current enforcement activity. And we have already stepped that up further following the Queen's speech. But I think it's also important just to be very clear, that's a portfolio of work which we have thought about quite carefully. So we look at the balance within that portfolio. We look at specific issues that we think are both troubling and need urgent attention. We think a little bit pragmatically around what we can realistically do. It is not realistic, even if we wanted to suggest the dismemberment of one of the large tech companies, to think that we would ever achieve it. So actually thinking a little bit around, well, what can we achieve, what is achievable, what is sensible, either on our own or talking to other regulators. a lot of our portfolio is also forward-thinking in terms of preparing for the legislation. We've now got a very clear steer as to the government's support, as to the shape of it, and so therefore we can use some of our market studies, some of our market investigations to effectively keep staying ahead of the game, to be as ready as we can when the legislation comes. And so it's very much within that, sort of that in mind, that, and I suppose finally, you know, you look around what's going on in other regulatory authorities. Sometimes we can play follow my leader. There are issues that are being picked up that are of concern to us, but we can actually pick up relatively easily. And then there are other gaps in the enforcement where there's clearly an issue, nobody's taking the lead, and it's appropriate for us and our market conditions. So I think you can rest assured that we will not be sitting on our hands, and that we will be trying to get a sort of balance between using our existing powers and preparing for new powers. I think one of the areas again that we will want to build on, and I think we've been ahead of the curve, is both our own data unit, which has grown over a period of time, and which others, I think, looking around the world are seeking to copy. But again, picking up on what Jill was saying, being clever, and Olivier saying being clever with resource. All government agencies are going to be under pressure given the cost of living crisis, given the impact of inflation. And we have got to just think about, well, we don't need necessarily two of those. If we've got one of them and you've got one of something different, that actually how we use those resources and how we use them most effectively, I think is if you like, our public duty. So I think the DMA, and you know, there was a moment when I thought, oh, it's really annoying, you know. and then actually I've been beginning to think, do you know, and it's the point, Olivier, that you were making, that actually it is, because it is now so imminent, it is forcing the tech companies to actually realise that the moment of reckoning on some of these issues is coming. And actually that has a follow-through effect for us. We may not have the legislation, but actually there will be dialogues, I think. I mean, some people will no doubt just want to have war, and others will approach these things differently. And I think, you know, we can see that as regulators in the way in which some of the large tech companies respond to us. And it isn't a one-size-fits-all. So, yeah, I'm marginally disappointed, but there's so much to be getting on with, and you suddenly find hidden benefits from other things. So, yeah, I'm still smiling.
So am I, and I'm sure anyone here who's involved in digital work at the CMA would confirm they're not sitting on their hands.
And actually, Amelia, I should just finish off on that. I mean, Google Sandbox, which again has been mentioned, is a really good example of that. And again, it's not just a domestic example, it's an international example. So, I think better together, as Jill said.
It's actually a really nice example where effectively the UK is taking the lead for the world. So I think the intention is that when the UK gets that resolved, I mean, there's been commitments, but now there's a process. But at the end of the process, the intentional hope, because obviously the UK can't commit competition authorities around the world, but the hope is that that will be a solution that the competition authorities of the world and regulators of the world can live with, which is a really interesting new way of doing things globally but locally. The other thing that you didn't mention, well, you mentioned implicitly, but it just might be worth everybody knowing here, is that the CMA has now published the Mobile Ecosystems Market Study Report and has initiated a new market investigation into mobile browsers and cloud gaming. So kind of watch this space on that, but that's going to be, I think, very, very interesting and kind of holistic piece of work.
As indeed is the piece of work that's been published already.
The piece of, yes, absolutely. It's really, really good piece of work. Definitely, all of you must read it. Louisa, if I move on to you, I mean, you've already said a little bit about the kind of the huge spectrum of things that Ofcom has to try and address. Maybe you could now say a little bit about how Ofcom is doing that, the various tools that you have at your disposal, and what we can expect to see from Ofcom over the next couple of years.
Sure, thank you. So as an ex-ante regulator, we already have regulatory regimes which cover a number of areas. But interestingly, a number of those regimes turned out not to be fit for purpose any longer. So we started kind of rethinking our regulation, and some of you might have seen last year we published a public service media review to try and think, how do we need to update the regulation, making sure that the rules to ensure that the BBC and our broadcasting market stays competitive are fit for purpose. But at the same time thinking about other markets, like the media bill, which amongst its rules tries to think of how do we ensure that our public service broadcasters stay prominent in a world where we have connected televisions. And further questions for us will be thinking ahead, how do we ensure that connected televisions, which are based on operating systems, remain competitive, remain open. We do not end up with another gatekeeper. So for us, the interesting role of a regulator is that of forward thinking in terms of which markets might tip, which markets might end up having a bottleneck. So it's that kind of forward looking, but then at the same time, making sure that we cooperate with the CMA, in particular, ICO and other regulators. So within the digital markets regulation, the idea is that the CMA will have the power to designate with strategic market status, but there will be some markets which are typically communications markets. So the CMA has a duty to consult Ofcom, but we are also able to use our market studies powers to start looking into some markets where we are worried there is a risk that the markets might tip, and then refer them to what will be the DMU. So the idea is really to bring these all together. So for me, the key points are agility, making sure that we have this forward-looking approach, and collaboration. And we've seen how collaboration worked really well on the publisher's platform report, which we published. It was advised to the government. The question was, there is obviously a question about the market power held by platforms that becoming bottlenecks for publishers. There is a bigger question there about publishers' sustainability. The Kane Cross review covered that, but really the key question was, how do we make sure that that huge bargaining power, the huge gatekeeper position doesn't then exploit publishers in a way that we start then effectively losing that content, or that content is exploited, and eventually there is no incentive for publishers to basically continue operating. So we've done a lot of thinking jointly about, what could a code of conduct look like? What could the rules be like? Should there be joint bargaining from the publishers, or should we have a code like the Australians with final offer arbitration? So in that sense, it's also important that we think about what are other international regulators doing, and then we design those rules jointly where it's the most appropriate way of doing it, to make sure that we try and have as effective an outcome as possible, but also have the agility to then review and refine those rules to make sure that they are effective. So in a sense, for me, it will be a little bit of an iterative approach, and some of these regimes will need to inform each other, but it's also important what we saw in the publishers' platform work, that the platforms have only one interlocutor there, where they have that discussion, and there's one position to argue with, and then to gather that evidence jointly and have common understanding. So to me, it's a great start. It won't be immediate, but we're definitely gearing up and preparing all the skills, and we're starting to see something coming out, which are very promising.
Thanks, Louisa. And I think one interesting point that really comes out of that is it's natural to think that once we've got the DMA and DSA and online safety regulation and the UK digital regulation, that's kind of done. But actually this is a hugely iterative area. Things just keep changing. Interestingly, when in the very final stages of the negotiations on the DMA, and you can correct me if I'm wrong on this, but they were trying to work out what extra services ought to go in, and there was a big debate about connected TVs, which didn't end up going into the DMA. But I think because there just wasn't enough knowledge at this point, now Ofcom's doing the thinking. We'll have to see what happens to the DMA in Europe in the future, kind of because there's all this kind of iterative process and watching of market developments and understanding of market developments. Jill, going to exactly that iterative and learning about
Perfect
things.
segue.
I mean, you could tell us, it would be really interesting to hear really about any of your research, but I know particularly you've done recent work on algorithms, you mentioned it. I don't know whether you wanted to tell us something just about the lessons from that work.
Yes, of course, and actually it's a really good example. You talked about pooling of the data scientists at the EU level, which is a sort of idea I love. It's a similar idea to how we approach this work. So Jonathan's already mentioned the CMA's excellent data team. We connected the heads of data science at each of the 4 regulators, and they came together over the course of the last year to really share their knowledge on what they were discovering on sort of algorithmic processing, and then engaged with industry, academia, and a few consumer groups to just sort of get a wide range of perspectives. And we've put out 2 publications. The first is on algorithmic benefits and harms. Obviously, that is a very well-researched and well-written about area. So in a way, there's no new news in that. What we have tried to do, however, is put together the most sort of really comprehensive and broad range of perspectives on the benefits and the harms, and really try and sort of, build on the classification and the bank of evidence that really supports those benefits and harms, so that we're helping advance our own knowledge, but also doing that very openly and in a transparent way. But what that led also is to a real discussion on the role of algorithmic audit. And there what we found sort of was slightly more stark, if you like. So we found through the sort of the stakeholder engagement that there's a lack of effective governance in the auditing ecosystem. There's a lack of clarity around standards. So what standards are you auditing to? It's very difficult for some auditors to access either the data or the code or the systems and processes that they need in order to do audits. And also there are insufficient avenues for redress. So if you find harm, or what happens? So with this, what we have talked about, and this is where the obviously any role for regulators would need to be proportionate, and that's why it's really important to have a really good understanding of the benefits and harms and how they weigh up. But what we've done in our call for input is just to sort of, and it's quite a humble sort of set of questions, but really asking, can we leverage our knowledge in order to play a role in how that audit market kind of matures and evolves, and becomes a more effective kind of contributor in the overall kind of landscape as it matures. So we've been really, the call for input closed last week, a few weeks ago. We've had a really good response. I think, from the range of sort of Microsoft, Google's, Tech UK, so industry, collaborations, big consultancy players like Deloitte, brand publishers, consumer groups like Which. So, I think we've got really good engagement on the topic, and I'm really looking forward to the data science leads, including Stefan Hunter, who sponsored this work at the CMA, who set up the data team. Really looking forward to working with them to where we take it next year. So I think for me the learnings are really around having the conversation with as broad a range of people as possible, and then sort of consulting as we go to make sure that the steps we take are really pragmatic. But I think, what we're leveraging is, I ran data science teams at Google across Europe, Middle East, Africa, UK and Hyderabad in India. And I think what I've been really impressed by since I've moved to this side of the fence is that the depth that is being built in the regulators of expertise, and I think the data team is outstanding, and there's some really good expertise at the FCA as well here. The depth that's being built is a real source bank of knowledge, and the information gathering powers as well allows us to get in a way that's really quite rare. So I think being able to kind of shine a light on some of the issues that are being found and have the conversation widely is a really important contribution to some of our biggest digital issues of the day.
Thanks very much. And I would just emphasise, of course, the huge benefit that academics can have on the algorithmic audit side. They don't usually have the option of going in and looking at how the algorithms really work. That's kind of left to the auditors and regulators. But they can very much look at the outcomes. Exactly. And there's been amazing academic work looking at the outcomes of algorithms, which in turn then tends to force regulators to think more seriously about to actually go and ask the questions themselves. So I think that synergy between the academic kind of curiosity and research and then what regulators do is hugely
I completely, I've just spent 2 years at Oxford Internet Institute doing an MSc actually, so I'm very delighted to be here. But the empirical studies really do open the lid on things, and I think they are critically important. It's why researcher access to data is really important.
Absolutely. I think everyone in this room would agree. Researcher access to data. Okay, so thank you very much. Just one last question on digital before we move on. Obviously we've heard that there's huge consensus on the issues in terms of the competition side and more widely in terms of digital markets. We're trying to be as coherent as possible between the EU and the UK in terms of how we regulate. But clearly there are many, many jurisdictions around the world. Everyone's looking at this area. There may be many jurisdictions that decide they want to kind of have a finger in the regulatory pie. On competition, antitrust law is broadly consistent across the world. There's little tweaks around the place, and some people go the EU route, some people go the US route, but they're both not that different. Is there a risk that digital regulation could become more fragmented across jurisdictions? And if so, is there anything we should be doing about that now to try and create a more holistic framework? I don't know if anyone wants to say anything on that.
No, maybe I'll give it a shot. Well, you said it. I mean, in competition terms, it's fairly consistent, frankly. And it's now more than 20 years that we have the ICN. And the ICN is very effective. We of course have a high intensity of contacts with the UK, with the US, with a number of others. But in ICN, we really work together. We have working groups. We research things. We meet regularly with basically everybody around the world. So that is taken care of in a way. I have the impression that the dominant model at the moment when it comes to the type of issues that the EMA tries to address is to entrust competition authorities. So I don't see a big risk in that respect. Of course, when it goes to what the DSA is trying to address, well, then it's different. I don't think colleagues in sectorial regulator are that integrated as we are in competition. So maybe there is an issue. But for competition-inspired regulations, I really do not see a big problem. I also see that, I mean, this commonality of diagnosis, and to a certain extent of ways to address as well. I mean, because the differences are significant, but not that fundamental either. When I look at the bills on the Capitol Hill, for example, a number of them are really remarkably similar to DMA, and others are not dissimilar. So in terms of fragmentation, I think what matters is, the ultimate question is, can the platform design one single model that complies with all the various regime? And I think clearly in that field that should be possible.
Perhaps on the content side, it might be slightly different. And this is now a debate which is just starting, because obviously this is new uncharted territory for us. We started regulating the video sharing platforms, but we can see already that different countries have a slightly different approach as to, freedom of expression, freedom of speech, and what is hateful speech, and where do you draw the line? And I think, it's early days, and obviously we don't have any regime in place apart from BSP, where we have now started looking at ensuring that the harmful content is taken down very rapidly, and that platforms have a proper system to ensure that they detect and take down the content and that protect users. But I think there will be interesting debates internationally as to where do you draw the line, and there is potentially a problem that unless we're able technologically to prevent users from bypassing different national regimes, some more harmful content might appear in different jurisdictions. So that's probably a new area where we should take the learnings from the cooperation on competition of the ICN and start thinking jointly about what should the rules be. BSP is clearly a European regulation. It was the last directive that we implemented before we left the EU. So I think that's a first step in the right direction, but there will be more to do.
No, I think that's right. I think that those issues, for example, around what is freedom of speech are, within jurisdictions, they're politically divisive, and so I think that is much, much more challenging. I was just very struck, just going back to an early part of the conversation, Olivier starting off by, if you go back to basics, actually the issues in antitrust terms that one is addressing are ones that have been addressed over the years, and they actually go right back to the origins of antitrust as I understand it. The sort of rocket science, if I can put it that way, might be amongst the algorithms and how do you understand what they're doing. But actually, if you keep going back to those basics, that commonality. But I think it is much more challenging in the regulatory.
Yeah, the Overton window is, I guess, a relatively old concept, but the Overton window in different cultures is in different sides of the building even. So, okay, so thank you very much. I think we'll finish on digital. We've only got 10 minutes left, so I apologise for anyone who really wanted to hear lots about the implications of inflation. We will. Because obviously it is kind of important. But we will cover that in the last 10 minutes. Obviously, that is the inflation is the big policy issue of the moment, really, at least in macro terms. It is, it's more of a macro policy issue than a micro one. But I do think that there are, likely to be implications for all of the regulators represented here in terms of their thinking going over the next couple of years, not least, inflation per se, but in particular its implications in terms of the cost of living crisis that we're failing. And Jonathan, it was actually Sean earlier already mentioned the energy prices that have already hiked and are going to hike further. So just a general question to anyone, I don't know who wants to come in first. I mean, do you think that do you think there should even be micro implications of the cost of living crisis for our regulators, or should it just be business as normal? We should, have a long-term view and not get distracted, or if there should be implications, what should they be?
Well, let me kick off. As somebody who has lived through periods of inflation, it is clearly very, very significant. We are funded by the taxpayer, and that for me is the starting point. We don't operate in a competition vacuum, we operate in the real world. And when you hear some of the stresses and strains that people are facing, we need to be cognizant of that, because otherwise we are, in my view, irrelevant. Now, there is only so much that we can do. We cannot solve all of these problems. But I personally think we have a responsibility where we can to help. And therefore, I think I can't speak for the CMA going forward, but I can speak for us now. We have a certain amount of choice as to the discretionary work that we do, and I think you should expect that some of that discretionary work will be more focused on vulnerable consumers and on obvious issues. Now, we are also, it is known that government has written to us, that is public, asking us to look at fuel prices. We will do. I don't view that as an attack on our independence. I think we were thinking about it already. We'd already done quite a lot of work on it. I think it's entirely appropriate. So that's my starting point, that we don't live in a vacuum and that this is a really serious issue, and it ultimately goes to our credibility.
And just, of course, to emphasise that, in fact, like Ofcom as well, the CMA, we tend in this group to think about the competition side of the CMA and not the digital regulation side, but of course it is also a consumer protection authority, and that's where the issues facing vulnerable consumers become particularly pertinent. Louisa, I don't know if you wanted to say.
Yes, we've spent the past 2 years at Ofcom really implementing a number of consumer protection policies. From most of you will have received an end of contract notification, something to alert consumers when they're coming to the end of the contract that they can switch, they can get better tariffs with other providers, or with their own existing provider, they can recontract and get better offers. And we've just published an ex-post evaluation of that policy, showing that a lot of people, rather than switching, are recontracting. So we are monitoring very carefully how those policies are working. We have social tariffs. We are trying to advertise their existence more widely. We are asking the operators to advertise to their users the existence of those tariffs. So we are keeping a close eye to see what is there that we can do in the mobile space. There are, airtime plans which can enable consumers to have much more affordable tariffs, and we have a general kind of eye on affordability. So we're also in discussions with operators. That's one of the advantages of being a sector regulators, where sometimes you can just nudge them to keep an eye to what's happening on the consumer side.
No, I can go. I think as Jonathan said, it's right. It sharpens the focus. It really sharpens the focus, and you can kind of look through your work plan with a whole different lens to it. And I think, if I think of some of the priorities we have, there's a lot around healthy online advertising markets, and the work that the CMA did on digital advertising markets identified excess profits in the UK of a couple of those markets alone to the tune of 2.4 billion per annum, and any headway into that we can make obviously brings down consumer prices through that. So I think some of the joint work we're doing on competition and privacy and working that through, I think, can be effective. Equally, a lot of the work on algorithms does does talk to pricing, affects pricing, and often that is targeted and can be targeted, sometimes inadvertently, at vulnerable customers. So again, I think the work on sort of trust and transparency in algorithmic systems does have real consumer benefit. So I think that's key. I think another area for us is actually tripping into sort of inflation, recessionary fears, and economic growth. So and our role in helping enable innovation. So one of the other areas on the work plan is the FCA and the ICO have done some really good joint work separately and together on creating regulatory sandboxes where innovators, large and small, can test out new ideas in a regulatory safe space and sort of get us, if you like, a sort of double tick as they go, so that they know that they are good to go ahead and meeting requirements. And what we're looking to do across the DRCF regulators is now looking at how can we expand that? How can we expand that across more regimes and potentially scale up? So that I think those contributions are equally important as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with all this, but I think we should be clear that, of course, competition maintains prices low and good regulation as well, etc., etc. But that's different from inflation. In many respects, well, don't want to start a lecture in economics, but that's clearly different. It's not completely alien, but clearly different. Second, there is in any case a different time scale. We downgraded Gazprom in April. The impact on the gas price in Europe is not really clear so far, and probably will never be. So, and yet we had very good reasons to do so, and we think they're infringing probably competition rules, etc. But so one of the results of this crisis is that competition authorities have been put under pressure. What are you doing for lower inflation? Well, we're doing a lot of things. The likelihood that it lowers inflation in any way in the short or even medium term is extremely low, because this is not what it is about. And I think we shouldn't be shy of saying it. We should not maintain expectations that we can do something about it, because it is extremely unlikely we can. So that said, yes. Second consideration maybe, it's largely a scarcity-driven inflation if you look at it. And you see it because if you look at Statista's data for, at least for continental Europe, big utility energy in particular, inflation rate over the last 12 months, 16 something. Now if you look at telecoms and digital, 4.1. And there are many reasons for that. One is that probably they have good profits, and that therefore they could absorb part of the energy increase, because they're, of course, big energy consumers. But they decided, even when they have they do monopoly pricing, that the best interest might be to keep, not to make the consumer pay for that extra cost. And the second thing is that these are largely what you call non-rivalrous goods. In other words, it's like the light of the sun. I mean, I can have as much light of the sun as I want. That doesn't do anything about the quantity you can have. So, because it's a non-exclusive consumption good. And the digital in particular is not exactly perfectly that, but largely that, because there's a number of bottlenecks. So in that very field, it is unlikely that we have this kind of impact. So yes, I agree. There is a case, in particular for some specific constituencies and some specific abuse on vulnerable customers, but in a way, whether you have high inflation or not, you should do it. Maybe the impact is bigger now, but on a wider scale, competition policy is not the tool to combat inflation, I'm afraid.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I mean, obviously, it does affect the politics around competition policy.
It does.
And I guess in the digital space, it may impact the feeling, how passionate people are about the fact that a lot of the digital services are free to at least some customers, which makes doing things that might imperil that more dangerous. But I think that's about the politics. That's not about what we should actually be doing. So I agree with you. So I should finish the panel. We've gone slightly over, which is a very bad way to start a conference, and I apologise to the next session. But thank you very much, and I hope you'll join with me in thanking the panel of illustrious speakers who did great.
Thank you.
All right. We'll move on now to the next part of the program, in which we're going to have a keynote from our own Hussein Kassim, who is a professor of politics at the University of East Anglia, and also a senior fellow under the ESRC UK in a Changing Europe initiative. He's going to be talking to us about the quiet transformation, revolution or muddling through, UK regulation and the regulatory state. And I'd like to invite you to come on up, Hussein. And really, this topic is of key timeliness right now, and one in which he will mention the CCP has been active largely through his leadership, or primarily through his leadership, but also with the involvement of many other members of the CCP and outside UEA. So Hussein, if I can hand over to you now, we will look forward to your words.
So thanks very much for the introduction. That very long title is a way of saying Brexit. And what happens now? Because I think I am the first speaker to say Brexit. We've heard exit as a euphemism, but that long title is, as I say, it means what happens now. So I'm going to start with an excellent book that I recommend to everybody. Bit of economics, a lot of politics. Mick Moran's The End of British Politics, and the late Mick Moran, I should say, because unfortunately we lost him a couple of years ago. But he tells the story of the British state in terms of a succession of epochs, and in each epoch is characterised by a particular form of state interventionism. That's what I'm going to return to in a moment. But there's also a specific economic model and a social contract, a different understanding of where citizens and businesses locate themselves with the state and what the state provides for them. As far as the 20th century is concerned, 21st century is concerned, he talks about the transition from the post-war social consensus to the Thatcher era. And this we see as sort of distinguished by a service sector-led economy, a strongly centralised regulatory state, but it's also embedded in global financialisation. It's really important that this is an open model, because the single market is actually part of this vision, the open borders, the four freedoms. But according to Moran, who wrote this in 2017, Brexit represents the end of the Thatcher era, not least because it brings, because of the trade barriers it erects, because of the frontier it reconstructs or constructs between the UK and other, and the EU, its major trading partner. And Theresa May, but also Boris Johnson, do embark on these new projects of relocating the UK within the world, so global what we've heard about, of a particular sort of image of the UK, but also of it's a populist project, more populist, that's more pronounced under under Boris Johnson, but we must remember under Theresa May that she was very concerned with the just about making it. So that was a very important part of her sort of her political philosophical credo at the start of her term. Of course, what I'm interested in, what the project is interested in, what I'm going to talk to you about, is the changing form of state intervention as part of that exit from the Thatcher era, and as the post-Brexit era unfolds. So you've no doubt heard about Sir Ivan Rogers, who was a UK permanent representative in Brussels for many years, and you may have heard him talk about Brexit as a revolution, okay? Or certainly the Brexiteers as revolutionaries. And the evidence for that, I think we can see in how they promised they would transform the state, in the kind of populist anti-expertise slogans that they used, and what that had a particular implication, I think, for the regulatory state, for regulation as we know it, for the remote regulatory agency as basically a non-majoritarian institution, an unelected institution of specialists, of experts, effectively. And we might have expected a kind of spectrum-wide transformation of regulatory agencies. We could have seen an increase in ministerial discretion, for example. There's a lot of language about the big state, the state levelling up. So we were quite. This wasn't hyperbole on the part of Ivan Rogers. It was, I think, a realistic expectation, sort of embedded in or at least grounded in the rhetoric of a lot of Brexiteers, and especially when you think about what happened to sort of impact statements and all the rest of it with the actual negotiations and the preparation for Brexit. It does seem that this was a really ideologically driven project. Okay, I don't think any of that's controversial, by the way. Okay, I take it as that we might all agree that was the case, no matter whether we stand on where we stand on the virtues of Brexit. So, as we all know, the UK left the EU at the end of January 2020, but it continues to be a part of the single market until the end of the transition period. At the end of that. That calendar year. I've actually managed to get the wrong date in here. But at that point, after more than 40 years of participation in this system of collective governance that is the EU, the UK left. Now, this is a system, again, whether one likes it or not, where UK rules had co-evolved with EU law, where the UK had shared regulatory tasks with EU bodies. There were a lot of tasks delegated, but also responsibilities pooled. And some regulatory responsibilities were transferred from the EU to the UK. What happened with Brexit is the reverse happened. Okay, that all of these functions returned or transferred back to the UK. Plus, there are a whole series of regulatory tasks imposed by the Trade and Cooperation Agreement. We mustn't forget that, because as well as the sort of the inundation of responsibilities that come from the transfer of those responsibilities from Brussels, came a whole new set of responsibilities. And this is what we wanted to map. Now, in a way, this is a historic document. This is I've got it here, and for anyone who's interested, I've got a small pile in the back row up there. You can help yourself too. And we thought that on the eve of the UK's at the end of the transition period, that we should map how ready the UK was for this return of regulatory responsibilities, and we should sort of put down a marker in a way to see how things would change from there. So it's a joint project between UK and Changing Europe. So I'm a senior fellow there, as Sean mentioned. The project I lead there is called Negotiating Brexit with CCP. I must say that a number of people in this room, Amelia Fletcher, Tolo Amandu, but others also contributed chapters. There were about a dozen people from CCP who sort of pulled their knowledge of all kinds of subjects from competition policy. So Andreas Stepan contributed that, food policy, data, regulation, and many other sectors. We also involved, not very visible at least to a colourblind person at the end, B&E, which is Brexit and Environment. We're very concerned this shouldn't only be economic regulation. So Andrew Jordan and Charlotte Burns, who are two of the leading scholars on environment, also contributed, and their network also sort of fed into this project. So here is the very invisible, or least legible slide that one often includes, but it reminds me to sort of to run through what we covered, just in case one of these falls in your area of interest. But we did a mixture of sort of transversal areas such as competition policy. We had Michael Harker and Catherine Wright, present and former member of CCP, talking about the architecture of regulation and regulatory agencies, and thinking about the sort of evidence that there has been in terms of a transition to a different kind of model away from the classic sort of Thatcher model of the 1980s. We had reflections on about trade in goods, on trade in services, and then we looked at particular sectors. And I think that the Andreas Stepan's chapter on competition policy, the chapter on public procurement by Albert Sanchez-Greles have been particularly particularly prescient. There was really evidence of movement already in their areas, but they sort of really picked up on that. Financial services, all kinds of transport, but also immigration policy, workers' rights, and asylum and refugees. We've got Catherine Barnard, who's the Professor of EU Law in Cambridge, and Steve Pearce, who's a Professor of Law at Essex, to contribute those chapters. So we were very lucky. Really did have the expertise in the room. All short pieces, all sharp pieces. What essentially we were asking them to do is to look at three things. We wanted to find what evidence there was of policy change or continuity in their respective domain, sector or subsector. We were interested in the characteristics of the new regime that they were seeing being put in place. And we were interested in two things there in particular. What were the powers and responsibilities of the UK regulators? How ready were UK regulators to sort of pick up their new responsibilities on the 1st of January? And what were the long-term prospects for what are the long-term prospects for de-Europeanisation, if we can call it that, of UK regulation, the exercise of UK regulatory autonomy? Because we're aware that the EU does many things, but often it's operating within wider international regimes. There are other kinds of effects which might limit what it is that the UK is able to do. So, with respect to the first question, again, I recognise this is a bit of a dated view, but we're going to update that a bit later this year, as I'll say towards the end. But with policy change and continuity, we found really the only sector where there was more or less a fully fledged new regime put in place was immigration. Agriculture, there have been a lot of sort of declarations about changes that are going to be made, a transition away from the kind of agricultural support that we've seen in that was part of still is part of the CAP, but also a host of new obligations and lost rights and freedoms in trade with the EU. What we're really conscious there is that there is policy continuity and a degree of change, but we wanted to capture the kind of full spectrum of what was being changed. So it's very important to look at things that were being lost and sometimes recreated, sometimes not quite recreated. So secondly, the new regulatory regime, very much a work in progress. A lot of delays in preparedness, some in terms of physical infrastructure. Probably the most famous is Northern Ireland, the Northern Ireland infrastructure, in the news, forever, for the last 2 years anyway. But also the sort of data infrastructure, the systems that were meant to be in place to enable lorry drivers, road hauliers to take their goods into the EU. A lot of issues still there. what many people don't really appreciate is that the TCA itself left open a lot of areas, a lot of unfinished business. It did so in different ways. In some areas, in parts of consumer policy, for example, it said, okay, well, let's leave this to the best endeavours of the two sides to agree at some other point. There's also sort of data equivalencies, which are really significant in the sense that they're not really tied up by the TCA. They have to be, well, effectively unilaterally decided by the two sides kind of independently. But the real change, we would argue, has been in powers and responsibilities. So there we found a lot of reduction in scope and number of functions. So the responsibilities sort of carried out by the relevant EU agency are no longer carried out by the UK counterparts in many areas. And I take as an example of that EASA, the European Air Safety Agency, whose functions were moved to the Civil Aviation Authority. And here, what's significant is that I feel like talking about civil aviation, which is actually the sector I know most about now, but actually a lot of the functions that had accrued to EASA, that European level agency, since it was created, relatively recently, have stayed there and not come back to the UK. The CIA basically does things that every national regulator has to do in terms of certification and inspections and the rest of it, that any civil aviation authority has to do throughout the world. Different as part of the EU, these were pooled, shared, and sort of carried out by a single authority. Now it's a single country that has to sort of take on that sort of heavy weight, redevelop the credibility, and recruit the staff effectively, and that's been the story of some, but not all, national agencies in the UK. There's also major question marks about the resources, powers, capacity, and design of national agencies, particularly national regulators, particularly those that have been created from ab initio. One of the examples is the Office for Environmental Protection. Although the director had just about been appointed before the transition period came to an end, the structure did not exist. The responsibilities of the OEP were not known, and there was lots of concern from environmental groups about continuity, but also about the extent to which the powers and responsibilities of the EU level agency structure and system would be reproduced at the national level, and those concerns I think have been borne out in the interim. It seems like the OEP, as just to give one example, doesn't have the same kind of investigatory or enforcement powers that are enjoyed by environmental agencies within the Union. There's no compensation for access to the EU. A whole series of instruments, whole communities of expertise, databases. The national regulators, UK regulators, find themselves in very different positions with respect to those. Common instruments can no longer be deployed in many cases. Communities of expertise really varies from sector to sector. We've just heard about how the CMA and the Commission are still talking to each other. But this isn't the case at all in other regulatory sectors. It's a real sort of problem in terms of how information and practices, approaches, basic information get circulated. And there's also access to databases. This is particularly important in the area of policing, immigration control, and frontier forces, where the key databases that sort of kept real-life information available, circulated and available to relevant authorities across the EU suddenly became no longer available to the UK. And this really mattered. There's a quotation in the piece on this by Steve Pears, where a Metropolitan Police Officer says, we use this 2 billion times in the last 10 years. Extraordinary. And there's also greater discretionary power for ministers in certain areas. The one that comes to mind is in IP. But this is also something that we're interested in sort of tracking in the Mark II, the second version of our reports, to see whether this is a sort of general pattern which might signal a move in a more sort of revolutionary direction. There's a lot of uncertainty about the impact of the results of the change, about equivalence in particular in the financial sector, but also with respect to data. There's also fears about double regulatory compliance. The best example of this, I think, is in chemicals, where a very expensive regime that businesses had already invested in, the REACH system, has been effectively replicated in the UK at the UK level. Well, at least the government announced that this is what it wanted to do. Business responded by saying, look, first of all, we've paid for this once already. Second, you really want us to sort of pay the dues in 2 different jurisdictions. And thirdly, if we have to choose, we're not necessarily going to choose to base ourselves any longer in the UK. I'll come back to UK REACH in a moment, because there's a recent report by the UOA which talks about this in a bit more detail. And there's also, of course, a wider politics involved. I mean, one of the interesting things to me as a political scientist is how little debate there has been about any of these changes, really, about the regulation. That, they take place in gatherings such as this. They take place, in parliamentary committees to some extent. They might take place behind the scenes, but they haven't really become a major subject of public debate, despite the real impact that they have on citizens and businesses. And I think that one of the things that the government has discovered is that it can essentially, if it sort of pitches the argument, just override or sort of confront face down or drown out complaints that are made about the costs or the difficulties that are being created here. One of the important dimensions where we have heard a degree of discontent, though, is with respect to those areas, environment, agriculture and others, that come under the responsibility of the devolved authorities. And there's been tension ever since the start there about who handles this. London is responsible for the negotiations, of course, but actually Edinburgh in particular, but also Belfast, have important responsibilities that they consider aren't really being factored in. The last question was about de-Europeanisation. And what we found are many constraints on prospects for regulatory divergence. The Trade and Cooperation Agreement in itself imposes a lot of limitations with respect to the level playing field, particularly in environmental, but also labour and competition policy areas. So it remains to be seen how constraining they are, but they are there. We should not forget them whenever regulatory divergence and its possibility is being spoken about. There's also other constraints, also deriving from international law, from international conventions and regimes. I've got 2 examples here, one from international intellectual property. So the UK is out of the EU, but still remain constrained by these European agreements, but other international agreements. 2, in the case of aviation, there's a very densely regulated it's a very densely regulated sector, and there's an international regime which will ensure that there isn't much scope for divergence on the UK's part. And it is interesting to see how modest, in a way, the ambitions that the current government has developed for the use of its new sort of post-Brexit regulatory powers is in practice. Another reason why prospects for de-Europeanisation are limited have to do with the Brussels effect. This is the mechanism that Anu Bradfield, professor of law in Columbia, has sort of famously identified. And her point is that lots of EU standards that become global standards, why would any business find it a good idea to deviate from those. So this is also a powerful constraining effect. So our early assessment is this isn't a revolution, okay, at least so far. There doesn't appear to be, there's certainly ideological principles, but there's not fully worked out blueprints. There's not a lot of mobilisation and evidence of sort of public discussion or persuasion about where the UK ought to go. It's somewhere between a quiet, uneven and incomplete transformation and muddling through. You might have seen the National Audit Office report, which focused particularly on the Food and Safety Agency and UK REACH. This really detailed the sort of concerns about design and about powers and about responsibilities a couple of months ago. And we're hoping to repeat our work across the same fields and same domains over the next few months, and we'll be launching a report in October. So I would invite you to watch this space. Thank you very much.
Shall we see if I think we have time for one or two comments or questions. So if anyone wants to ask Hussein a question, please just raise your hand.
Thank you. Thank you very, very interesting talk. I was just wondering whether your research are you aware of research that's, oh thank you, concerning the Brussels effect and the degree to which the UK will or may become a rule taker, which is sort of the opposite of what I understood the intention of Brexit was, but it may turn out to be the case. So does your work cover that? Thank you.
We this particular report doesn't, but this is something we'll aim to look at in October. So, yeah. What I thought you were going to ask for a moment there is, have we looked on the other side? And I'm very pleased to advertise a sort of report done by an academic colleague, Michael Cading, who said, what's been the impact of UK the departure of the UK on EU agencies? Because that's also a really important question, I think, unmonitored so far from the UK, so far as I know. But very significant. Looks like it's lunch.
And I think we'll just a little bit of advertising for your future report to say, because you are going to be doing a second version of this, right?
Yeah, so a second version of this. Please help yourself to, as I say, to the first edition somewhere on the back row there. There's a pile. So we'll be launching at the British Academy, I think on the 13th of October this year. Same authors are saying yes, but also a few more perspectives.
Thank you again. And we're off to lunch now for 1 hour, so we'll see you back at 1.